Good evening, everyone, and thank you again for joining us in this individual review. And we are also grateful to the Collectors Admiralty for their constant support and for providing us another book that we are going to review right now. So, in case you haven't actually joined the Collectors Admiralty and their cause, their Facebook page is provided down below in the description. So today's book is M.R. James' Collected Ghost Stories. Now, he is basically an Englishman. He's from the Victorian era. He's actually from the late Victorian era, during the twilight years, around the time when you could say Thomas Hardy was around. And I'll just read his biography just to give you context. Montague Rhodes James, 1862 to 1936, was the son of an East Anglian clergyman and was born near Bury St. Edmunds. He was educated at Eton and King's College, Cambridge. His antiquarian propensities were evident when he was a schoolboy, and in 1886, only 4 years after coming up to Cambridge, he was appointed assistant director of the Fitzwilliam Museum, director 1894 to 1908. Probably because of his Cambridge connections, old boy network. But that is just an opinion from my side. It could have been because he had a propensity for the stuff, so his field. So yeah, and they've already provided it. He was a brilliant linguist, paleographer, medievalist, and biblical scholar, and his apocryphal New Testament is in print to this day. He was elected a Fellow of Kings in 1887 and became successively Dean, Tutor, and then Provost. He was Vice Chancellor of Cambridge University from 1913 to 1915, and in 1918 he took the slightly unusual step of accepting the Provostship of Eton College, which, though a sister foundation to King's College, is regarded as the junior. M.R. James never married and died in 1936. So, we know he was a biblical scholar, a linguist, a paleographer, and a medievalist, which means that he had a background in European history. Why ghost stories, right? I mean, if he was such a prominent ghost story writer, if he was such a prominent entity in the horror genre as it does exist today, why isn't he put in the same category as, say, Edgar Allan Poe, Stephen King, as H.P. Lovecraft, or even any of the Gothic horror writers of their time, or before him? It's an interesting question, and one which made me curious because I never heard his name before. And reading through his stories, they do have elements of Gothic, high fiction, and are definitely horror stories in and of themselves. What makes him stand out, in my opinion, and probably the opinion of those who've actually read his short stories, his ghost stories in particular, are that he takes elements of Edgar Allan Poe's approach and adapts them to a more realistic aspect. So they're stories that progress in the typical horror story standard. The protagonist heads over to a location, the location has some sort of a secret hidden in it. That secret, once discovered, produces some sort of metaphysical sensation which is not described in the context of what the person had actually felt. Rather, it's the terror which this metaphysical sensation causes to the victim, which gives us an indication of the kind of horror they went through. Unlike Edgar Allan Poe and even H.P. Lovecraft, that make M.R. James unique is most of his stories tend to be realistic and not as nihilistic as you would expect from the latter two. In fact, in most of his stories, the narrator is telling it from the first person. He uses his experience from Cambridge to describe the areas around him, and because he himself was a biblical scholar, he understood the liturgy and all the associated metaphors and idioms and even the intricacies of that field. And it weaves itself into an exceptionally unique set of short stories. And they're good. Like, they're actually really good. They're the kind of stories which actually force you into being an active reader. You can't skim through them. You actually have to read through every single word in order to really grasp the horror, which is very implicit. So, unlike Edgar Allan Poe, where essentially the horror itself is, well, it's iconic. Like, take The Raven or take his other stories. I can't recall them at the moment, but most of my viewers, as well as generally anyone who's watching this video, has read their fair share of Edgar Allan Poe stories. I don't even need to tell them, you probably have those in mind. And with H.P. Lovecraft, apart from the Call of Cthulhu and his entire Eldred Gods series, there's no nihilism in these stories. Essentially, it's more along the lines of Jorge Borges in terms of just being realistic, being the observations of the first person. And that adds an element of horror to it because you don't know the kind of horror which is actually happening in it, if that makes sense. What makes it even more interesting is that there are these portions where he will redact the name of the location, or he'll give some sort of an excuse where that location is not mentioned. And one could assume that it's probably because the experience itself was so horrifying, the narrator does not want someone else to experience it, which only adds to that inherent human nature of being curious. It's quite fascinating, actually. And this is actually a Wordsworth classic publication. Something which I was informed by the Collectors Admiralty was submitted by a gentleman who purchased it from an old book bank in Rawalpindi. For those of you who don't know, old book banks are they're pretty much part of the city itself. They're pretty much an entire fabric of life in Rawalpindi city. So imagine this bookshop which has really, really old books. I mean, second-hand copies, books which were donated in big shipments, and books which do not hold value or worth to their owner. So they're just tossing them away that someone else could actually use them or read them at their leisure, which is very common in Pakistan. Nowadays, because in most cities, most of the bigger bookshops actually have licenses to sell the relevant publication. In old book banks, you could get books like this, like this edition in particular, as an example, was published in 1992. In fact, there might even be an updated publication of this available by Wordsworth, which definitely has updated stories, new manuscripts, and so on. But these are some of the many things that you could find easily over in old book banks, if you're willing to scrape through all the books in order to find it. So you need to make an effort in order to actually get to these books specifically. And if you can get a copy of this on Amazon, which I'm sure you'll be able to, it's a Wordsworth classic after all, I'd recommend it. If you want to read it in the Collectors Admiralty, I was informed by their administration that you need to be present physically on location, such that someone from the TCA headquarters, someone from the TCA library is able to monitor you while you're reading it. You can't actually issue these books until and unless your until and unless you are one of the contributors to this cause itself, as I've been told. It used to be the case that anyone was allowed to be published books in their library, so long as the book itself was not considered vintage. In their definition, anything published prior to 1950 is considered vintage. This would have been allowed. They informed me that because these books are becoming rarer, and now since 40 years have passed, 30 years essentially have passed since 1990, no, 40 years actually. 40 years have passed, 10 more years, and this will actually become half a century old, which would mean that they would be avoidant of issuing it willy-nilly. You can still read this. In fact, if you want to read through it, there might even be a publication of it in Project Gothenburg, which will be linked in the description. And in case there are any audiobooks available, those will also be linked in the description as well. And it is a good book. It's unabridged. It's the complete short stories as of 1992. And M.R. James is really underrated in a lot of context of collecting ghost stories. So whenever you have the time, just click the links down below with the audiobooks when they're available, and if not, then the Project Gothenburg links and any public domain versions of M.R. James short stories will be linked in the description below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and this is the part where if you want to leave, you're welcome to. You could proceed onwards to something else which you could watch, and if you're still interested, then just like and subscribe. Thank you.